People think of tilt as what happens, which it often does when you're on a losing streak or take a bad beat, and therefore you can have different reactions, right? You can either try to chase your losses. Just as often people become way too tentative and risk averse, but like winner's tilt can be just as bad, right? If you have a couple of bets in a row that pay off, especially if they're contrarian bets, like, one of the things I think of Elon Musk's issues is like, or Peter Thiel, for example, if you make a couple of contrarian bets and they pay off, I mean, it's really satisfying to get a financial purse. It's really satisfying to prove people wrong. And if you get both at once, I mean, it's like some drug cocktail, seriously, that has like profound effects on you. And then you do that like twice, have a couple of bets that pay off. And it's, very hard to outlive that in some ways. And if it goes wrong, then you're kind of chasing the high that you had before. And so it's hard to get off that roller coaster, I think. So the kind of instant gamified feedback, especially through Twitter in particular, which I think seems to drive certain people, maybe including the founder or the owner of Twitter, slightly crazy. I think that kind of is an accelerant.
Hey everyone, Rob Wiblin here. Today, I speak with famed election forecaster and author Nate Silver about his theory of Sam Bankman-Fried, the cultures of effective altruism and rationality, how Nate would do effective altruism better, or at least differently, whether effective altruism is incompatible with game theory, how similar Sam Altman and Sam Bankman-Fried really are, whether it's selfish to slow down AI progress, the ridiculous, absurd 13 keys to the White House model, whether prediction markets are actually now finally overrated rather than underrated, and whether venture capitalists talk a big talk about risk while actually pushing all of the risk off onto other people, that is, the entrepreneurs they fund. The conversation orbits Nate's recent book, On the Edge, where he lays out this elite culture clash that he thinks is really key for understanding the times we're living in. Basically, he lays out the village, which he says is, the liberal establishment, Harvard, the New York Times, academia, media, government, all of that. And then there's this other culture that he calls the river, which he defines as very analytical, but also highly competitive. And on Nate's story, there's a whole lot of different streams to this river, including poker and sports betting, quant finance, tech entrepreneurs and crypto, and I guess the effective altruism and rationality communities. And the common cultural traits that hold them together include comfort with challenging authority, decoupling, contrarianism, using explicit models, higher tolerance for risk, and I guess maybe, in my mind, above all, the use of expected value calculations to decide what calculated risks to take. Nate thinks the river has been gaining influence at the expense of the village, which has had a mix of good and bad effects, mostly good in his and my view. And it's also brought the river and village into this kind of open conflict. We mostly stick to other topics that Nate hasn't addressed elsewhere already. So if you want to hear that particular story, you'll want to grab the book On the Edge. But otherwise, without further ado, on a whole lot of other topics, here's Nate Silver. Today, I'm speaking with Nate Silver. Nate, as I imagine most listeners will know, is the creator of the FiveThirtyEight website and election forecasting system, which I imagine many people like me have doom refreshed over the many years. The years since it's been running, I think I first started looking at it back in 2007 during the Obama-McCain election. You've brought me sanity and anxiety in equal measure over the years. But you've since sold FiveThirtyEight, and you now publish your election model through the Silver Bulletin on Substack that people can check out. But we're here chatting today because you've written this book, On the Edge, the art of risking everything, which talks about, on the one hand, gambling, sports gambling, poker, that kind of thing. And then in the second half, you turn to effective altruism, rationalism, existential risk, AI, that sort of thing. And I guess Sam Bankman-Fried, who you spoke with at some length after his downfall. So yeah, we're going to talk about a bunch of those themes over the course of the conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Of course. I'm always happy to be on a show I actually listen to.
Let's talk about effective altruism a bit. That's the thing I want to spend the most time on, because I think you haven't been asked about that so much in other interviews. I guess, so you did interviews with quite a lot of people involved in the rationality community, the effective altruism community, and I think you try to do us justice. I try to be fair and point out the good things, but you also don't pull your punches, and you point to a lot of different ways in which people have criticized it, maybe legitimately. So I was very interested to hear a bit more about. I mean, when you're building anything, you have to make a lot of difficult decisions, a lot of difficult trade-offs. Are you going to be kind of more political or less political? Are you going to be more lavish or more austere? And usually there's competing considerations on either side, and someone who has a strong preference either way, you're going to get criticized probably from both directions if you're striking a balance. So I was kind of curious to hear your overall takes on where could we be better in practice, not just what are possible weaknesses, but where would you direct things differently, and maybe where would you have directed things differently if you were helping to set things up back in 2011?
So the kind of funny thing is that the book is about a certain type of person who is very analytical and nerdy and good at things like decoupling, where you're removing context from something, where they have an inclination to quantify things, even things that are hard to quantify. And so like poker players have this, sports bettors have this, people in venture capital have this to some degree. It's a slightly different skill set, but close enough. And the EAs have this. But in every other field, you're kind of like competing by some standard where you get feedback, I suppose, right? And you kind of have like this incentive to be accurate, which is often a financial or career adjacent incentive. And I guess the irony of the book is that so you might think the EAs are really unselfish, which I think they are. I mean, I think they literally are in most cases altruistic, and I think their hearts are in the right place, and I think they're very intelligent people. And I think that just the fact that whether it's because of EA or kind of EA adjacent, the fact that you have all these multi-billionaires now donating a lot of their net worth and at least making some efforts to see that the money is donated well. I don't know if Bill Gates would call himself an EA, but clearly is espousing some of the same ideas and is very rigorous about it. That is doing a huge amount of good for the world. But the irony is not having as much skin in the game. I think sometimes EAs don't learn as much about the kind of limitations of models, so to speak. And may also be, as in the case of SBF, a little bit too trusting. In the poker world, we learn to have a healthy amount of distrust, I suppose.
Yeah, on the trust point, I think you quote someone in the book that in 2022, effective altruism felt like the world's biggest trust bubble. Do you feel like that bubble has popped to an appropriate degree? I think we've become less trusting. Have we become the right amount less trusting?
Yeah, maybe it's about the right. I mean, this is Oliver Haberka, I think, who was kind of EA. Everyone says they're EA or rationalist adjacent. Yeah. Yeah, it's still a pretty small world. If you go to the Manifest conference, for example, which is probably would say it's more rationalist than EA, but it's not a huge number of people. You can kind of trace most of the intellectual history of these movements by profiling, 10 or 12 people prominently, which is not tiny, but not super large. So no, I think, I think it probably errs a little bit on the side of over trusting, and maybe could use more outside view within the movement. I mean, but really look, some of it's more critique of utilitarianism, especially the kind of Peter Singer, maybe more strict, quote unquote, impartial form of utilitarianism. I'm more sympathetic to rule utilitarianism, for example. So that's part of it. Part of it is I think you have to update significantly on SBF, right? This is where Scott Alexander and other people have said, yeah, well, who could have known that he would be a once in a generation fraud? But again, if you kind of get into risk assessment and you're not assessing risks to your internal movement, and I think that it wasn't like he was running some secret sex ring on the side, right? I mean, I think he was kind of in his core activities being untrustworthy and in ways that did give off a lot of signs. I mean, he told Tyler Cowen, the economist / podcast extraordinaire, that if he could press a button to make the world 2x plus some epsilon as good with a 50-50 chance of blowing the world up, then he would press that button repeatedly, right? I don't think I want that guy to be the major funder for, along with Dustin Moskowitz, but I wouldn't want him to be a major funding source of EA, and the way he kind of founded FTX, and former people at Alameda were not that happy. So I think, given that it's a small world and that he was a big part of the small world, I think you have to update significantly for now based on SBF.
Yeah, the quote where he said he'll destroy the world if with 50% chance if he could more than double it. You say in the book that a lot of people with a background in philosophy say stuff like that. But I mean, I heard that and I was like, this is philosopher talk. No one would actually do that kind of thing. And I think in the great majority of cases where people say stuff that sounds a bit crazy like that, that is the case, that they're kind of just in a philosophy seminar room, basically. And I didn't actually think that, even Sam meant it. How do you tell whether people actually are crazy or when they're willing to indulge in thought experiments of that kind?
I mean, I talked to Sam, and you're right. I mean, there are definitely people kind of in this space that will be kind of trollish or provocative, or it's a thought experiment, and that maybe is kind of left unstated. Even the Nick Bostrom kind of paperclip scenario was kind of I think sometimes taken too literally, it kind of is a thought experiment that's kind of cheeky and funny. I mean, it's not the result wouldn't be funny, obviously. Look, I think Sam was relatively serious about this. He was very consistent about saying this. I talked to Sam about 5 or 6 different times, kind of both before, during, and after the bankruptcy. And he was pretty consistent about saying that, like, if you don't take enough risk to literally destroy yourself, then you're not maximizing your expected value enough. I don't think I'll get in this Kelly criterion thing, which is a sports betting formula, but he is willing. So basically, the quote unquote rational thing to do is to maximize your expected return conditional on not going broke, right? On having very low risk of ruin. We can call Elon Musk a risk taker for buying Twitter/X at a price of $50 billion, but he is, unless there are shareholder lawsuits that get out of hand, like no kind of risk of ruin, existential risk to Elon Musk from maybe if it's a poor financial purchase of Twitter. Whereas Sam really did think that if you are not maximizing your chances of becoming like the world's first trillionaire and or the first autistic, I guess, U.S. president, then you're not taking enough risk. And so, I think there's some degree of pathology there.
One reason I never believed that Sam really, really meant it to that degree, and the reason was obviously if he talked about how he cared a lot about existential risk, about AI, about these kinds of relatively niche causes. Obviously, if you have $1 billion, you can fund many of the things that you care about within that area. If you have $10 billion, now you're going to be really struggling to find anything else to fund. There's hugely declining returns on dealing with these issues. Why would you double down and take a risk of ruining yourself and ruining everyone around you in order to get $1 trillion when it's not even clear what you would spend that money on? It made no sense, and so I just assumed that kind of he was just mouthing off saying, "Oh, we should take a bit more risk than people usually do." Like, what was going on? Was he kind of Was he an idiot about this on some level? I don't get it.
I mean, he made it several bad risks, right? I mean, the decisions that he made, for example, during his trial about whether to testify or not, the source I talked to after, he's a named source in the book, a crypto attorney is like, yeah, the government had him dead to rights. Like Caroline Ellison's testimony is extremely persuasive. Sam is caught lying multiple times. It also contradicted things that he told me for what it's worth. And so, yeah, all he will do, he's not a very sympathetic defendant. All that he'll do by going on trial will be pissing the judge, who's a no-nonsense judge, and the jury off and giving himself a longer sentence, which is exactly what he did. He probably, cost himself, pending appeal, an additional 10 or 15 years in prison by insisting on taking the witness stand. When I talked to him in Palo Alto, about, 4 or 5 months before the trial, and said, what if they offered you like a 2-year plea deal? 2 years, kind of slap on the wrist after that. You probably can't do crypto stuff again, but 2 years, and then you can, get some new money and do a new startup. And he's like, I'd have to think about it. And so
you shouldn't think about it.
Yeah. So I think he's like not very good at assessing risk or has some type of destructive streak. I mean, I think too, this is me being a little bit more speculative, right? Sam is somebody who says that he has Asperger's or is on the spectrum, right? And yet is kind of like thrust into an environment where he is socializing a lot and is kind of like a big public figure. I think one thing there's some poker players that are examples of this who also self-diagnose as having autism or Asperger's, and they kind of play characters in essence, right? Where if I can adopt a persona or a character, it's almost like how a large language model would do it, right? It's like, okay, the LLM can adopt the persona of like an Irishman who's had too many pints of Guinness or something like that, right? And that's like almost easier for it than having its own independent persona. And I feel like sometimes with people who are on the spectrum, they do that and then forget that it's a persona and come to own that, and it becomes kind of a shtick that they kind of lose sight of. Or I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I talk to Sam more than a lot of people, but like you'd have to ask his parents or something.
So the autism thing, that could be one factor. But I think there's this other archetype, which is someone who is really smart. Maybe in some senses they have good judgment to start with, but then they become very successful. They have a bunch of wins unexpectedly. Maybe it's a combination of skill and luck. They get on Twitter and they're posting on Twitter all the time, and it just seems like their judgment degrades and they start taking kind of wild swings at things.
It's very hard because I've been a couple of times where I'm on the, not to Sam's degree, right, but enough that like, there were times like after the 2012 election where you would go out and get a coffee in New York or something, and probably more than half the time I go get a coffee or something, then you get recognized in public. And so like I'm aware of, like, I don't particularly like that for what it's worth. But I'm aware of as your fame ebbs and flows, kind of how much more sycophantic people become, how many more opportunities you have, how being kind of a celebrity has a weird pull where you kind of become detached, or you can become detached from the real person, because like in some sense the idea of celebrity is like an object that exists outside of you, right? That's what celebrity is like this idea of Sam Bankman-Fried or Nate Silver, or I don't know who else a celebrity is, I don't know if Eliezer Yudkowsky's a celebrity, but but he's kind of memeable. And that's a very weird thing, maybe especially if you're having some neurodivergence or diversity, I suppose. And yeah, it's not surprising that, and also like some of the things too that we talk about in the book, in the context mostly of poker, but also traders on Wall Street, you also have like chemical reactions when you're on a winning streak, right? You have powerful endorphin releases. You probably have more testosterone and things like that. So like, the fact that people seem to be unable to avoid these parables that seem so predictable about kind of like being hubris on a winning streak and hubris and getting in over their skis, it's quite literally almost chemical.
I mean, I find this quite disturbing, because I think you can just observe that many of the most powerful people, the most influential people in society at any point in time are kind of at the peak of their careers after a long streak of unlikely successes that have brought them to where they are now. And they're kind of on tilt in this way that they just feel kind of godlike at that moment, or they feel that things can't go wrong. They're just that their judgment is so good, and they start taking bigger and bigger risks, and they end up affecting all of the people around them with this kind of distorted judgment.
Yeah, people think of tilt in poker as tilt is playing emotionally in a way that is costing you expected value, basically. People think of tilt as what happens, which it often does, when you're on a losing streak or take a bad beat, and therefore you can have different reactions, right? You can either try to chase your losses. Just as often people become way too tentative and risk averse, and you have to be aggressive in most forms of poker. But like winner's tilt can be just as bad, right? Where, you can tell yourself in advance, hey, look, if you're the best player in the world, right? And there are 10,000 entrants in the World Series of Poker. If you're the best player in the world, your chance of winning the World Series of Poker are probably 1 in 1,000. So you have a 10x return, which is actually very, very good, but you're still there's still overwhelmingly luck. And if you have a couple of bets in a row that pay off, especially if they're contrarian bets, like, one I think of Elon Musk's issues is like, or Peter Thiel, for example, if you make a couple of contrarian bets and they pay off, I mean, it's really satisfying to get a financial purse. It's really satisfying to prove people wrong. And if you get both at once, I mean, that's like,
it's a hell of a drug.
It's like some drug cocktail, seriously, that has like profound effects on you. And then you do that like twice, have a couple of bets that pay off. And it's very hard to outlive that in some ways. And if it goes wrong, then you're kind of chasing the high that you had before. And so it's hard to get off that roller coaster, I think.
Yeah, I don't really know how to fix it, but I think it's a deep systemic issue. I mean, I guess it probably has been the case in every society at all points in time. It's like created disasters.
Yeah, but I think we also have like focal points in today's society where the fact that you have this instant feedback where things are quantified, right? I mean, on social media, if you have a book out, then you can refresh the Amazon page and see what your ranking is, or see what that new review is, a 2-star review from that person in Des Moines, Iowa, screw them, and things like that. So the kind of instant gamified feedback, especially through Twitter in particular, which I think seems to drive certain people, maybe including the founder or the owner of Twitter, slightly crazy. I think that kind of is an accelerant.
Let's talk about expected value for a minute. So I feel like doing expected value calculations, or thinking about expected value, assigning probabilities, assigning benefits and costs to things, and then weighing them all up. I think that's kind of maybe the most distinctive trait of this river tendency that you talk about in the book. It's almost like the thing I think that defines it primarily. I think it's also the thing that is perhaps most distinctive about Sam Bankman-Fried. This has shown up in a lot of books where he just seemed to think in expected value terms all the time. I guess Michael Lewis really emphasizes this as something that I guess he found, even Michael Lewis, I think as a financial journalist, found this to be a little bit extreme. What should we take from that? Should expected value take a big status hit because Sam Bankman-Fried was so into it?
I mean, again, I think he was actually a pretty bad EV maximizer, right? Look, one thing you learn from poker and the game theory of poker is that you're very often indifferent between one or more solutions. And then often in equilibrium, the EV differences are quite small. So people I don't know, people agonize over which restaurant should I go to, or how do I kind of plan my flight itinerary. And probably in situations where things are competitive, that there's not a whole heck of a lot of a difference. And so I think spending less time on those problems and picking at random can be helpful sometimes. I think people sometimes have a bias against things that can be quantified versus things that can't, but they still value quite a bit. That was an issue in COVID, for example, that we saw on the news tickers, BBC or CNN, the number of COVID cases or deaths in a certain area going up, right? There's no ticker for disutility from being unhappy because of lack of social engagement or future expected value loss from loss of educational years or things like that. And so I think avoiding those biases and defaulting kind of more toward common sense, quote unquote. I think many things that we think of as being irrational are probably rational on some slightly tweaked version of rationality, right? And they're often, I think, as you go through life, you're actually, it seems pretty common, oh, this behavior that we thought was irrational, actually, now that we have better data, actually, it was really quite smart, right? And so I think kind of trusting markets a little bit more and realizing that cases where people are behaving persistently irrationally are not rare, but maybe kind of rarer than you might assume when you're green under the ears, just kind of getting into being an EV maximizer, I suppose. So kind of, respecting revealed preference and market wisdom a little bit more.
I was trying to think, what takeaway do I make from SBF being so obsessed with EV and it seeming to lead him astray? I guess one thing you could say is, well, EV, expected value, that is the wrong way philosophically, theoretically to weigh up costs and benefits and probabilities. But I don't think I want to go down that road. You could say it's good in theory, but it's bad in practice because humans are so bad at doing it. And so maybe we just shouldn't use it at all. That seems too extreme. So I think instead you should say what you should do. That should be one factor in your decision making, but it needs to be paired with common sense checks and heuristics and what do other people think. You don't just take your expected value estimates literally, which I guess people have been saying kind of always. An alternative angle would be it's actually none of those things. The issue with Sam Bankman-Fried was that he had the wrong values. That in the expected value calculation should have been, and then I'm stealing the money basically, and that should just get a massive negative, that should be massively penalized because you should disvalue it. And he kind of failed to do that because his values were bad, or at least they're not our values. So of course that's going to lead him to do things that we would evaluate negatively.
Yeah, I think there's also a real question about whether he had an urge to be self-destructive.
You could talk about that a bit more because I haven't heard that so much.
I forget if it's Tara or Tara McCauley, who was his original co-founder at Alameda and was one of many people who quit Alameda before Carolyn Ellison took over, before FTX because she thought Sam was behaving, you can read in the book, I don't want to misquote her, we're in the UK where they have stricter libel laws, right? But thought SBF was a liability in various ways. And she said that Sam would confide in her that prison didn't seem so bad because he didn't really he has anhedonia, self-diagnosed, which means a lack of ability to process or feel pleasure. So if you don't enjoy whatever people enjoy, right, going hiking with your friends or, or whatever, drinking and eating or having sex or whatever other people do to enjoy themselves or playing sports or going to a sports match and watching sports, if you don't get joy from any of those things, then
maybe you just feel very detached from your decisions. Or
then you feel very detached from your decisions and there's not that much consequence to I am not sure how you go. But if you're promising that, you're in heaven, you're going to have all this access to all these things, right? There'll be all these virgins in heaven kind of, and you're not experiencing the pleasures of the flesh on earth or something. I think he's an unusual person. I'd put it like that, right? And, even among gamblers kind of celebrate the term degen, short for degenerate gambler. That's kind of taken as a term of affection, right? Oh, I won the tournament. Don't worry. I then degened up at the club, right? Or degened up at the blackjack tables, right? Gave some of it back. And it's seen as a badge of courage and kind of honor and gambliness, right? But yeah, the line between self-destruction and rational risk-taking is often, I think, quite thin.
Something that you talk about you address very directly in the book is how similar are Sam Bankman-Fried and Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. I guess obviously they're both one of them was a CEO, one of them is a CEO. They're both called Sam. What are some other ways, other similarities that are parallels that people could draw between them?
Certainly I'd say Sam A is familiar with the expected value framework, right? I mean, he's explicitly kind of saying, and when I talked to Sam A was in mid-2022, which turned out to be a good time to talk to him because this is when they are aware of how much progress that GPT 3.5 and potentially 4 are making. So they're kind of like sitting on this very cool secret almost. But also he's like not quite as much in the spotlight. So he's like a little bit more unguarded, right? The explicit invocation of kind of explicit or expected value thinking where he'll say, yeah, actually, there is a chance that EV could go, or not EV, there's a chance that AI could go very, very badly. And if it's misaligned, could even, severely harm, destroy, catastrophic effects for civilization. But I think it's going to end global poverty and extend human lifespans and push us to the next frontier. So therefore, it's worth the risk. Now, I don't think he'd like flip the coin for 50-50, right? Like one source said he might flip the coin for 90-10, right? Mm-hmm. And he has said things that that prove he's not a strict utilitarian. One thing he said, I think in an interview in The New Yorker, is that like, yeah, I value my friends and family way more than random strangers, right? Like, I don't know if he was aware of how much of an EA trope this was, but he was like, yeah, I would like kill 10 strangers, like defend my family or something, which actually made me more trusting of Sam A, I think. But, but the fact is that it's kind of like maybe the anonymous collective that kind of really runs the AI labs anyway. It's like the kind of silent votes of people who are, of the engineers who build these models. And so,
could leave.
And could leave, or we saw like what was I think maybe somewhat incorrectly billed as the EA coup against Sam Altman. I think the reporting on that's more banal, actually, that it kind of was actually was what it sounded like, which sounded very boring, but like a lack of transparency and internal struggles and things like that. Although I don't know. I mean, I was going to say you're going to get like the game theory equilibrium in AI, which I think is true. Although because you have like a finite number of players, then it's a little bit less obvious. I think probably individual actions matter more from someone like Sam Altman than in a more open competition.
So it sounded like one distinction that you're drawing is just that you think Sam A is making more high EV bets, that SBF just had bad judgment and he made bad bets. He did things that were negative EV, whereas Sam Altman has good judgment, and so he's doing things that have like he's taking more positive EV bets, and that's the difference. Of course, that's not really a deep structural difference as much. That's just kind of one of them. Well, I suppose it does really matter, but the situation would otherwise potentially be kind of analogous in the willingness to take risks with other people's well-being. But actually, when I thought about this, I realized that I think there are some quite important structural differences. One is that SBF was deceiving people into thinking that their money was safe and that he wasn't gambling with their money and with their assets and with their well-being. He was pretending that he wasn't. Whereas Sam Altman, to his credit, has been completely honest that AI could kill us all, that it's extremely risky, and that kind of what OpenAI is doing should maybe be of concern to other people because it's going to affect them a lot, and it could be very negative. That seems very different because that means that other people could intervene. People could try to regulate OpenAI if they disagreed with the risks that it was taking. Whereas it was kind of impossible to intervene if you don't realize that that something like this is going on. Did you agree that's kind of an important distinction?
Yeah, and I'm not sure everything that people are, people especially like who are not familiar with AI or maybe on the left in the U.S. are like, well, everything he's saying is kind of like to his advantage. I think that maybe slightly misunderstands how this tribe of nerds behaves. I think for the most part, they actually are pretty truth-seeking, I suppose, and
I just think he said that because he thought it was true, and I don't know, maybe he's just a little bit loose of a person, and so he was just willing to say the thing that he believed, even if it wasn't in his selfish interest.
He says things on Twitter that are like a little too candid for a CEO of a company as large as OpenAI, but that makes me trust him more in some ways, right?
Yeah. I guess and the other important disanalogy that I thought was SBF's depositors, whose money he was gambling with secretly, didn't stand to gain if he made good investments. He gained all of the upside, and they took all of the risk if it went below zero. On the other hand, with Sam Altman, it's not really like that at all. It's true that Sam Altman personally stands to gain enormously and disproportionately if OpenAI is successful, both financially and in terms of reputation. Like, he would be one of the great figures of history if things go well. On the other hand, if AI goes well, everyone else is going to benefit enormously. We all have enormous equity in this technology going well. So the upside and downside risk is more balanced. We all have like skin in the game to a similar degree.
Look, I think one of the things we haven't mentioned yet about SBF was that he assigned no diminishing marginal returns to additional wealth, right? Because he claimed he was going to give it all away, and or because he had such crazy ambitions, like I guess kind of like buying the presidency, that he cared about the first 100 billion is equally good to the second 100 billion, right?
Whereas which is crazy on any view, but right. Yeah, setting that aside.
Yeah, whereas like Sam Altman is going to have all his material needs fulfilled for the rest of his life, even if OpenAI gets shut down by the government. Well, I don't know what kind of liability he might have, right? Maybe I take that back. But like, once you get to a level where you have, I don't know, high 7 figures to 8 figures in the bank and you're readily employable and you have and annuitized income streams, then yeah, you 10x your money and you might increase your personal utility by 1.05x or something. And maybe you increase by 100x and you can buy a share in a basketball team or things, or, it's one thing about working on this book is I spent more time with like really, really rich people than I had ever before, right? You're like, yeah, their lives aren't really that much better, right? I mean, they're like a little bit better. Some cooler things. They have really cool homes, but like they also have like more burdens and more people they have to pay, and like so
more people hassling them.
Right? So it's like not actually that much of an increase in utility necessarily. See, I think one thing that people from outside the river, as I call it, misunderstand is that it's like people are actually not that monetarily driven. They're driven a lot by competition, by wanting to prove people wrong, and that the finances are a way to keep score, and or that making lots of money happens to be like kind of 0.9 correlated with kind of winning this competition, even though it's like not quite the same thing.
Yeah. So you talk about various virtues and vices that effective altruism might have, or various weaknesses it might have. I'm curious to know, all things considered, are there other groups doing philanthropy better than OpenPhil or competing with OpenPhil in terms of their impact per dollar? Or are there other groups that give a better advice or similarly good advice to 80,000 hours on how you can do good with your life or your career in your view?
Not that I think it's probably a pretty big gap. Although, again, I think, the Gates Foundation, I went to some dinner that Bill Gates hosted. It was not on the record to the extent I can share specific comments, but enough to say that like they are quite rigorous about what they do, and he is very knowledgeable about the different programs and how effective they are, relatively speaking. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a pretty huge win. Even if you kind of assume that maybe the models are like, maybe there's kind of some mean reversion versus what the true value of a malaria net is versus the estimated value, and maybe you're making slightly favorable assumptions, like, the delta between malaria nets in Africa and giving to the Harvard endowment is like, it has to be like 100,000x or something, right? In fact, I think actually giving the Harvard endowment is probably disutilitarian. I think it probably is actually net
could be harmful,
bad for society. So yeah, I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruit and easy wins, and but one property kind of being in the process of kind of being like a gambler or doing adjacent things for a long time is I think people don't quite realize the curve where you only have so much low-hanging fruit, and then it gets harder and harder, and or there are more competitors in the market, and then you kind of quickly get to the surface where we're going for smaller and smaller advantages, and then small errors in your models might mean that you're into like negative expected value territory. So
do you think that might be going on with OpenPhil to some extent?
Look, I think that on the charity side of things, then they're probably still doing a lot of, I don't know, maybe at some point you need, I don't do like corporate or nonprofit governance stuff. Maybe you actually want things that are a bit more siloed, right? Maybe you want like X-risk people and you want philanthropy people, and you don't necessarily want them in the same meta structure. You want two different organizations. Maybe I don't know what other issues there are. If they're kind of like red teaming for future types of risks and stuff like that. But yeah, maybe you need more separation. I mean, for one thing, as this movement, or if this movement kind of broadly grows, then like I think again of like the Manifold Conference in Berkeley, California, which they've had now a couple of times, where you're getting people from different parts of this world. That's at kind of a critical mass of size where like right now it's really kind of cool and really fun, and like and everyone knows one another. But if it grows, it's going to become larger. And I don't know if the existing structures can hold that. So, I mean, I think maybe having different teams that are competing in some sense instead of having one superstructure, that seems probably directionally right to me, but I don't know.
Yeah, I guess you end up with a lot of problems as you try to scale a group. Like the trust networks start to break down because people don't really know who's trustworthy because the group's too big. You have competing demands and competing kinds of people who want different things from the group and can't all be satisfied at the same time.
Yeah, and like pluralism is a very robust heuristic, generally speaking.
I guess you've mentioned you've listened to the show a bit, so you might have some sense of the sort of things that I believe, the sort of things that 80,000 Hours writes on its website. Do you feel like you have any notable disagreements with the sorts of things that we say?
I mean, directionally, probably not. I think sometimes people underestimate how back of the envelope some of this stuff is, and it's kind of easy to say going in, this is just back of the envelope, it's just a guesstimate, but then you kind of become overly committed to the model later on, or things are kind of like lost in translation later on, potentially. I think there are things like, the example I give in the book is like trying to estimate like animal welfare, for example, where like, was it Will McCaskill's like, yeah, it's based on the number of neurons. So actually like an elephant's worth more than a person. I mean, I think the thing I'm most sympathetic to about EA and rationalism more broadly is like society has to make decisions actually, right? I give the example in the book of like a dog named Dakota that runs into the subway in New York during what's going to be rush hour in an hour or so. And New York City Transit Network has to decide, do we shut down the entire F train, one of the busiest commuter trains from Manhattan to Brooklyn, to protect the life of this dog, this puppy, I guess, named Dakota. And they like decide to stop the train actually. So in that case, you kind of actually have to like calculate the utility of like, what is a dog's life worth versus X amount of delay for Y amount of commuters. And by the way, what if one of them's an emergency worker and can't get to the hospital in Brooklyn on time and things like that? Then maybe an actual human being dies. Maybe an area of under coverage or a neglected area is like, utilitarian thinking for like medium scale, like governmental problems, I think is actually probably more needed, right? Government heuristics are often very politicized, very cumbersome, a reluctance to employ like cost benefit analysis. So for things like the COVID vaccines, distribution schemes for the COVID vaccines, you had very different schema in the UK and the US. In the UK, they're like, well, we looked at the chart and actually there's an exponential curve where the older you are, the more likely you are to die of COVID. So let's start with the 95-year-olds and then go down by like 5 years every couple of weeks. Whereas in the US, you have this whole kind of complicated framework trying to balance equity and trying to balance utility and different things, and like didn't really make any sense. I think governments should be more utilitarian with a constraint of, obviously I'm a big, liberal. I believe in protecting people's rights in that classical liberal sense. But like within those constraints, I think, there's so much more government money spent than there is charitable money spent. I think it's like a really neglected cause area, basically.
An unusual critique that you make of EA in the book is that it's kind of not compatible with game theory. It's not evolutionarily stable. Like you talk about, in the long run, people who just use their resources and their time to benefit strangers or people who they're not kind of in a mutually beneficial relationship with just tend to get outcompeted and disappear. It's an interesting worry. How do you think that might cash out in sort of what you would do differently? Because I guess the natural thing you might think is, well, okay, in that case, the EA community needs to like have clearer boundaries and needs to benefit people inside those boundaries more and like do less to help total randoms or strangers. But I think then you can imagine the criticisms that would come from that kind of mentality.
I mean, part of this is like, there's kind of two parts of it, right? Like one is kind of more abstract game theory critique, where if you're not defending your turf, then you tend to get trampled, right? If you have, if you're having like a football match and one team is super competitive and trains really hard and the other team says, yeah, well, we think football is actually destructive. We're just going to run around and kick the ball around and have fun and be inclusive, right? Well, if you're judging that competition, the competitive team wins every time, right? And maybe there's like a slight there's maybe a slight aspect of like kind of social Darwinism in the book where I think, in a kind of capitalist system, unless you are able to kind of constrain competition, then the more competitive side usually wins out. But it's also kind of like meeting people where they are in the middle in terms of human nature a little bit more. One of the things I don't like about the Peter Singer book is that it says that, okay, well, let's say you give a little bit, and then you feel good about yourself. And so now you go and get like a nice dinner and have a, nice bottle of French wine or something, a medium range, right? I don't know what it is exactly. Well, you should feel guilty about that too, right? Like I think meeting people halfway between like common sense and kind of some Singerian utilitarianism, I think would actually go quite a long way. But yeah, I worry about people who are not willing to, if you're not willing to counterpunch and you're not willing to like defend your turf and be like somewhat partial toward your group or your tribe, then I do worry that you'll kind of get hoodwinked or trampled over. And in part because like, in some ways, game theory is the most important concept in the book. We talk a lot about expected value, but game theory is what happens in a world of 8 billion people where everybody's trying to maximize their EV more or less. I think that in a world of 8 billion people, that disincentives you create or opportunities you have to be exploited will inevitably result in your being exploited, right? Because you have so many opportunities for people to do it, right? So if you have, for example, a financial system where you have moral hazard, where if you make these risky bets, then the government will bail you out. Therefore, you have more incentive to make risky bets. Like within some period of years or decades, some or a number of firms in the system will figure that out and build models and price that in and begin to make those bets like almost inevitably. So, if you don't have robust enough kind of like fraud detection characteristics, if you're prone to getting hijacked by actors who take your good faith movement and your kind of trust in strangers and use it to politicize their agenda or to build clout for themselves, and I think like you will actually be exploited sooner or later at the end of the day, right? You see this actually in, I think, some kind of typical liberal institutions like the academy, for example, where the academy might say, well, look, we want to provide impartial expertise, but we also have values. In the U.S., we're probably progressive Democrats, right? We want to be more inclusive, and we don't want to help Trump win, and we want to be anti-authoritarian. What happens is kind of like, therefore your expertise gets hijacked by the politicized people. I'm not quite explaining this well enough, but
you're saying over time, the people who are more willing to cut corners on the intellectual honesty become more prominent?
That's the equilibrium, right? That if you tolerate intellectual dishonesty, then the equilibrium is that intellectually dishonest people will gain stature within your movement, right?
On this question of how much, I guess you mentioned the Singer book where he was saying, any money that you spend on yourself, you ought to feel bad. The book both mentions, this worry that effective altruism as a community might be too austere and might be too demanding, and say that you should feel bad whenever you, if you have children, if you do anything for yourself. On the other hand, you also mention with an eyebrow raised this very lavish, I think, donor dinner that Sam Bankman-Fried organized somewhere, and I think it's been a very difficult balance to strike between, on the one hand, saying, well, you shouldn't spend too much money on yourself or on your projects because that's kind of self-indulgent. You might trick yourself that this is a good idea when it's not. On the other hand, people can criticize you for saying, well, you're not actually willing to spend money in ways that are useful, or you're insisting on too much austerity, more than people are willing to live through. Did you have a view on, are we striking the balance wrong in both directions at different times?
I mean, the idea of giving 10%, I don't think is the worst idea necessarily. I mean, I think that kind of meets people in the middle. Yeah, it's a little tricky. I mean, I don't think, especially because I do think the critique that that EA flatters the sensibility of people who are not necessarily rich, but have skills that tend to lead to a lot of financial wealth. I think that's actually okay, right? I think people are too concerned with, this person donated billions of dollars to charity, but they're the wrong person, right?
I still don't like them.
Yeah. I like it when multi-billionaires give billions of dollars to charity, for example. I mean, the other kind of critique I have of strict utilitarianism is that it's too complicated to implement in practice, that you probably need some simplifying heuristics that work pretty well. I'm not sure kind of what heuristics I'd apply. I mean, it's also it's maybe lacking a little bit of kind of quote unquote political common sense. I suppose that 11 Madison Park is the most famously opulent vegan restaurant in the world, right? And if you had called me, I'm kind of like a New York foodie, and said, Nate, pick a restaurant that will be equally good, a little bit cheaper, and that you'd never have a negative headline from because it's less well known, Yeah, I don't know. And I almost wonder whether it's kind of a flex from SBF, who I guess kind of hosted the dinner there, right?
Yeah.
But maybe showed kind of like a lack of political awareness, I suppose.
Yeah. In the book, a kind of recurring thread is to say, well, you're a bit unwilling to fully embrace effective altruism because you have these reservations about utilitarianism. I think many of them are kind of the classic reservations you might have about lack of side constraints, like not valuing sufficiently a wide range of different things. Only caring about well-being, not caring about autonomy, that kind of thing. I guess I feel like that's a little bit of a shame because when we were trying to figure out what should effective altruism be, how should it be defined, what should be in and what should be out in the very early days, I kind of thought of it as an attempt to take utilitarianism, get rid of the bad parts. Like there's a whole lot of commitments that it has that are totally unnecessary. They don't really they're unpleasant, but they don't actually they're not load bearing in any way. Let's take the good part of it, which is it's nice to help people when the benefit to other people is very big, the cost to you is very small. Strip away all of the unpleasant parts, and then go with that. And I guess hopefully add in also, and you can't steal, you can't do all these terrible things. How would you, do you think, is that a good aspiration basically to have a philosophy of life that is about benefiting, or that puts benefiting people front and center while stripping away the parts of utilitarianism that almost nobody is on board with? In
principle, I think, sure, yeah. I think one of the problems that the movement has, it's kind of at a little bit of like an awkward teenage phase, I think. It is a relatively young, how many years is it old, depending on how you define it, right?
Oh, I guess at most 15, yeah.
Okay, so yeah,
maybe more like 10,
kind of a tween or whatever, or a teenager. One point the book makes in trying to trace the intellectual history of EA/rationalism, which I think are actually in some ways less alike than people assume, is the fact this is kind of born out of these small networks, primarily at Oxford and or in the California Bay Area and or on the internet. And it's all people who know each other, but it's people who bring different things to the table, prediction markets, animal welfare. Some are kind of tech accelerationists. Some are maybe a little bit more socialist potentially. Some are very concerned about the public perception of EA. Some want to discuss genetics and really un-PC things. And kind of as community gets larger, then maybe some of the contradictions become a little bit more apparent, right? I think in the current form of EA, there is more Singerian utilitarianism than I might want to be a buyer for, I suppose. But I don't know how you change that. This is where I kind of think that maybe the movement needs to have to cordon off when Standard Oil broke up or something, right? Maybe you need a U.S. branch and an Oxford branch, and I don't know, something that's a little bit more different and pluralistic.
I see. So you could kind of break into different brandings that are more specific, more niche, and don't have to overlap so much and feel like they're sharing a common identity. And then you could have them kind of disagree and debate amongst themselves.
Yeah, and you have one big conference every year that rotates locations or something, and I think that might be healthier.
You mentioned that you like rule utilitarianism. Should EA try to become rule utilitarianism? So this is something where you say, rather than look at every single act that you're doing and try to maximize utility from that, you try to figure out what rules of behavior would lead to the best consequences in general, and then you try to follow those general principles of behavior. It seems like a pretty good thing in practice.
Yeah, so as a game theory guy, then I believe, kind of that's solving for the equilibrium, right? If everyone behaves this way, then what's the equilibrium that result looks like? I think that's an order of magnitude more robust, also harder to calculate. But I am almost ready to endorse rule utilitarianism, I suppose.
Yeah. I guess rule utilitarianism struggles a bit philosophically because you can always say, well, at what level of generality should you be thinking about the actions? Why? So, why that level of generalization? Why not go down to the very specific circumstance that you're in? And then you're just back to act utilitarianism. And I'm not sure how to fix that philosophical question, but in terms of practice, it just seems vastly better. It's a much better thing to actually advocate for because it will lead to better consequences because people will do more useful things with that idea in mind.
But look, that's the kind of skill. So in kind of going around and talking about this book with a lot of people, it's not that hard to explain expected value, right? Say, okay, well, you're playing poker. There are 52 cards can be dealt, and here's your average outcome. And then you have to be more abstract about that when you're dealing with situations where there's incomplete information, whatever else. But the notion of the game theory equilibrium, I think, is actually kind of the more important concept in the book. Because I think people are actually rational within their domains when they have skin in the game and have a repeated problem, right? I think people are, get good at getting what they want, the things they prioritize within the constraints that they have. And, not treating the rest of the world like, non-player characters where they don't have any age. I mean, I see this mistake made so often.
What's an example?
I mean, in politics, you see it all the time, right? 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now, right? And like after Obama's rise in 2008, 2012, so I guess 14 years ago now, 12 years ago, you had Democrats saying, "Oh, look at these trends, right? We have like all the people of color, and we have all the younger voters, right? So extrapolate that out, and we're going to have Democratic supermajorities now for the next 20 years, right? Well, it doesn't account for the fact that you have a competing party and that you're taking for granted. Okay, well, what if your actually share of like the white college vote goes down? All these kind of union workers that used to vote Democratic but are now culturally more conservative. What if a Donald Trump comes along and not a Mitt Romney, and it's much more appealing to them potentially? The fact that in American elections you have elections are so close to 50-50 is like actually a big proof of game theory optimum solutions, right? In some ways that the parties are pretty efficient at dividing up the electoral landscape, but not treating the other side as though it's not capable of making intelligent adaptations.
Yeah. One benefit of having grown a little bit older is I think I remember following elections when I was a teenager, and whenever there's a big victory for one side, they would say, "Oh, the other side, they're going to be out of power for a generation," and I'd be like, "Wow, huge news, so incredible!" Yeah. And now I've heard that dozens of times in my life, and I don't think it's been true a single time. Maybe it was true once.
No, and even more. I mean, like the incumbent effects in politics are much more minor now, or maybe even reverse, right? You'd actually rather be the opposition party. People want more balance and want to switch back and forth a little bit more. So you're almost like giving money back, 30 cents back on the dollar whenever you win an election by making yourself more likely to lose the next time.
You were talking about the value of game theory. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I mean, just that I think people should, this is like the Tyler Cowen, if you read March and Revolution, right? He's always saying like, solve for the equilibrium. I think that's like a really good, something I found helpful, right? Thinking more about game theory terms about like, what's the behavior that results, even if I'm like running like my newsletter or something, or like, what's the behavior that results if everyone behaves this way? Or if, and in some ways it could actually kind of makes you behave with a longer term focus and maybe even more ethically. So one thing that you learn from game theory is that if you try to like exploit somebody, then you can be exploited in return, right? If we're playing rock, paper, scissors, do you that game in the UK?
Yeah. Rochambeau.
Rochambeau, okay, whatever, right? And you, Robert, are always throwing rock, and therefore I'm like, oh, I'm just going to play paper every time. Well, all you have to do is then one-up me by then playing scissors, right? And so it becomes a circular thing where the GTO, game theory optimal equilibrium, is to randomize one third. And having played enough poker where I've been in enough situations where you think you have the edge, and you think you're able to kind of like not cheat in like an actual cheating like using cheating devices sense, but you're trying to like exploit somebody as a game theory term. And before you know it, you're the one you're taking a shortcut, and you're the one who's paying the price for that.
One of my favorite tweets of yours ever is, well, when they go low, we go high 80% of the time, and knee them in the balls 20% of the time.
I think it's important to have mixed strategies, right?
Yeah. You talked about how, I guess, in the book, you draw a distinction between EA culture and rationalist culture. And I think at one point you say, EAs are very reserved and well-spoken, very, very, very PR concerned. I think one friend said to me, I wish that were true. I don't know what EAs this guy was talking to. But then I guess you are drawing a distinction that is somewhat real between EA culture and rationalist culture, where rationalists, I think, are much less concerned about appearances, about comms to the general public. They're kind of just willing to say whatever's on their mind, no matter whether people find it offensive or not. That's true to a greater extent. Do you think EA culture should be more freewheeling and more willing to just say stuff that pisses people off and makes enemies? Even if it's not maybe on a central topic. It seems sometimes in the book like you think maybe. Like directionally speaking, yes, right. I think it's like to say things that are unpopular, I think is actually often an act of altruism. And let's assume it's not dangerous. I mean, I don't know kind of what counts as dangerous or whatnot, but like to express an unpopular idea, or maybe it's actually popular, but there is a what's it called? Like not a consent spiral, but like an information cascade. Yeah, a cascade where people are unwilling to say this thing that actually is quite popular. Like,
I find it admirable when people are willing to stick their necks out and say something which other people aren't.
I think the reason the EA culture usually leans against that, or definitely not always, is just the desire to focus on what are the most pressing problems. You say like, well, the stuff that really matters is AI, regulation of emerging technologies, poverty, treatment of factory farmed animals, and these other things that are very controversial and might annoy people in public. I think EAs would be more likely to say, well, those are kind of distractions. That's going to cost us credibility. What are we really gaining from that? If it's not a controversial belief about a core, super pressing problem.
Well,
are you sympathetic?
This is why I'm now more convinced, divide EA into the orange, blue, yellow, green, and purple teams, right? Maybe the purple team is very concerned about just maximizing philanthropy and also very PR concerned, right? And the red team is more... a little bit more rationalist influence and believes and takes up free speech as a core cause and things like that. I think it's hard to have a movement that actually has these kind of 6 or 7 intellectual influences that get smushed together because it's all people getting coffee together or growing up on the internet in a more freewheeling era of the internet, 10 or 15 years ago. I think there are similarities, but to have this all under one umbrella, I think is beginning to stretch it a little bit.
Yeah. I think that was a view that some people had 15 years ago, maybe, was that this is too big a tent. This is too much to try to fit into one term, effective altruism. And maybe I do wish that things had been divided up into more different camps.
Yeah.
That might have been more robust and would have been less confusing to the public as well, because as it is, so many things are kind of getting crammed into these labels of effective altruism or rationality that it can be super confusing externally because you're like, what, are these the poverty people or are these the AI people? These are so different.
Yeah, I think in general, smaller and more differentiated is better. I don't know if it's a kind of long-term equilibrium, but you kind of see actually over the long run, more countries in the world being created and not fewer, for example. And in COVID, there was going to be originally more stuff in COVID on the book, but no one wants to talk about COVID all the time 4 years later. All the big multi-ethnic democracies, so, especially the US, the UK, India, and Brazil, all really, really struggled with COVID. Whereas the Swedens or the New Zealands or the Israels or the countries that were able to have, or the, Taiwan, they were able to be more fleet and had higher social trust. I mean, that seemed to work quite a bit better. So maybe in a universe where where medium-sized is bad, right? Either be really big or be really small.
I see. So something like liberalism or be much more niche. Let's say that you had $10 billion. You're given $10 billion and a research team as well to start a new charitable foundation to try to do as much good as possible. It's like, what are we doing, Nate? How you've interviewed hundreds of people?
I buy an MBA team. No, I don't know. Maybe I'd start from scratch and kind of think about maybe you just need a fresh start and kind of say, what are the truly neglected areas now? I mean, it kind of seemed, it seemed, I'm sure 10 years ago that AI was very neglected. I wonder if those heuristics need to be updated. I wonder if climate is this example of this issue that EA sees as over-indexed, right? There was a lot of concern about climate, but what if you built climate organizations that are quote unquote more rational? Is that an underexploited niche because they get so political and they get so embedded in the kind of progressive politics, right? What if you, could you build a climate organization that's somehow immune from, shall we say, the dangers of wokeness and things like that, and co-option from people who want to adopt that for non-climate objectives? I mean, that might be interesting, for example.
Yeah. There are people trying. We'll link to some episodes of interviews of people trying to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess maybe one thing that I remember from that interview is saying, wow, renewable energy is actually funded so much and it's so popular that if renewable energy works, then kind of we're in the clear on climate change. So they focus a lot on what if renewables is a bit of a bust? What if it's very disappointing? What stuff do we need in that case? So it's very river style thinking. Are there any other problem areas that you think might be underrated or that you would ask your research team to look into? I
mean, the one I brought up before is efficiency of government spending. I don't know I don't know how you persuade governments to do this, but pursuing reforms Like, I think lobbying for governments to increase the pay scale and to become less bureaucratic, maybe more Singaporean, I suppose, like actually probably has like a quite high payoff, and like things like government waste and corruption and inefficiency, like seem like they're such like stodgy concerns, but like, why does it cost 20 times more to build a subway station in New York than in Paris, right? Like that is a cause area that I think that EA or EA adjacent people could start to look into a little bit more.
Yeah, I think on the civil service reform, I haven't heard EA talk about that almost at all. I guess I'm imagining Zvi Mowshowitz might have talked about it, but he might be the only one. The on the subway stuff, actually, I mean, Openfield does actually fund Institute for Progress and a bunch of other kind of progress studies organizations.
Yeah.
So I think they do have they've dipped their toe in the water there, even if it's not a main focus.
I mean, like this is a very niche cause, right? But I think economic history is a vastly, and this kind of ties into progress studies, is like a vastly underrated area, right? So like to fund at, some 7-figure annual salary, like an economic history institute that kind of is part of the Progress Studies Institute. Like I think that would actually, in terms of like basic research, would be quite beneficial potentially.
Remember, Openfield tried to fund a bunch of people to do macro history research. I think Holden was really into this back in like 2016 and 17. I don't know how much came out of that, but I guess it was an idea that they at least thought of. Any other stuff that stands out?
What was the episode a couple of weeks ago with like electromagnetic pulses?
EMPs, the nuclear war expert. Yeah.
I mean, things like long-term data storage and robustness, I think, and things like that are maybe, the amount of like link rot on the internet. Like, I don't know who owns archive.org, but you probably want like a backup to that. And I mean, that seems like important.
Yeah, I think that's one that I don't think has been funded. I mean, I guess we had an interview years ago where we talked about if you wanted to send a message to a civilization that was going to re-arise in 100,000 years, how would you do it? Turns out to be extraordinarily difficult. I don't know whether anyone has actually funded an attempt to figure out how you would do it in practice.
But I mean, it comes up in various scenarios. If you have like a nuclear winter, like how do you rebuild and things like that? I think that type of contingency planning might actually be pretty valuable. I mean, I also worry that like, this is too much of a diversion for this point in the conversation, but like, the loss of ground truth data is something I worry about a little bit, that having like a little bit of ground truth data you can treat as absolutely true and reliable is, I think, creates hinge points that make models potentially much more robust, and is something people should think about.
And how are we losing that?
I worry that, if you now go and like do like a Google News search, right? Like you no longer quite, like everything is a little bit, I don't know quite how to put it. You can't like quite see like the dates of the articles anymore, or like how many articles actually meet your search query or things like that. It's like taking away things that are just kind of basic reliability checks as far as data goes. It's like too algorithmatized, right? Or like, I thought the Google Gemini stuff where it's like inserting command prompts that the user didn't ask for, and I think it's kind of like actually insidious and coercive. Like I think that's quite bad. I think that's actually quite evil to like be presenting one thing and then putting a thumb on the scale in a way that is not what the user expected. Like I thought
that was a little bit more boring maybe than people made out. It's like Google's kind of behind the ball game on AI. They're trying to rush out these releases. They're like, people complain that the images have too many white people, so we're going to like throw this into the prompt to try to patch that and fix it.
It is kind of funny, but like I worry when there's not a sense of like, I worry when like data companies become less transparent, I guess.
So is your concern that, like, I guess, when things are, like in the digital era in general, like things are becoming more recursive, or it's like harder to find like what the records objectively are because you don't have access to them because kind of the company can just close it off, or have a prompt, they don't tell you what it is? It's
the kind of recursiveness issue where maybe you kind of like, lose. I mean, there's some like metaphor that I'm failing to make here, but like if you kind of, the fact that we might have trouble like building things, if you don't keep the original design for things, then that can cause problems down the road. That there are probably some things that we're actually worse at as a society now, I mean, red teaming the concept of what if there were like a nuclear winter and we had to begin to rebuild society. I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm not like a big like space exploration knowledge haver exactly, but like, but it kind of seems like if you buy the Toby Ord argument that, civilization has a 1 in 6 chance every decade of destroying itself. Like, is it seen as like too cliched for long-termists to think more about space exploration or things like that? Like, I don't know. That seems like a piece that maybe is seen as cringe, but like maybe people should be thinking about more.
Yeah, I guess because I think most of the risk comes from AI. The AI would chase after you.
I understand the Eliezer argument, right?
Yeah.
But like,
so there's that one. I mean, I guess it helps with bio potentially if you have like separate groups. Although then you wonder why not put them under the sea, or it's probably easier to be on the sea than to be in Mars. One thing that I wasn't sure about, so I guess currently I think the effective altruist-inspired giving is kind of maybe half in the give well, global health and well-being style. So it's not all bed nets. There's also funding, reductions in air pollution in India, and policy change, that kind of thing. But that sort of focus, and then maybe the other half is on everything else, including AI, risks from new pandemics, so the whole other more speculative, more future-focused bundle. In the book, you say you don't really want to go in on you maybe want to just demur on the question of whether it's good to have more people in future. Like that philosophy doesn't super interest you, and I guess you find some of the idea that just adding more people without limit is massively better is not super appealing. But you also think the risk of doom from AI is like 2 to 20%. So I wasn't sure. Ultimately, would you spend more than half of it, or like would you fund AI more or less than what you think people do now?
I mean, you also get these arguments about like whether doing research in AI research capabilities is actually kind of, whether it's actually doing good or is actually kind of accelerating and nerd swiping people into spending more investment in AI. No, look, I probably more, but I might, try to find ways to make the teams that are tackling these problems more diverse in different ways, and maybe having like kind of more of an outside view potentially. I worry a little bit about groupthink in these movements.
Do you think they're too technical, or maybe just too focused on like rationalist style thinking, perhaps? Like not from enough different disciplines?
Yeah, I think you could use, I made the same critique during COVID where like, people who are into public health, but you didn't have like, you didn't have enough economists actually consulting on COVID policy. And I kind of like wonder if you don't have like almost a reverse problem here, right? You imagine like in all the sci-fi movies, Contact or whatever, or what's the other one? Arrival, right? You always have like the anthropologist who comes along to talk with the aliens and understands their culture, and the linguist and people like that. I wonder if we'd like need a little bit more of that. I feel like there's maybe a stigma around people who are theists a little bit in EA, and I actually kind of do think that, it raises some questions when you think about consciousness and things like that. You probably want more theists in EA and studying AI and things like that, for instance.
I think that is a problem that is slightly solving itself as AI goes more, or like these worries go more mainstream and more people get involved. I guess it's starting from a very low base of diversity of styles of thought.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to bring up COVID, but let's do it. I think there's an interesting mistake that I think people in the river, possibly you are also making. When you're used to kind of economist-style reasoning, it's very tempting to think, well, with COVID, there were so many harms that came from all of the control measures that we implemented. Massive cost to mental health, massive cost to the economy, all of these different things. So what we should have done is like move along the marginal kind of cost curve. We should have done somewhat fewer restrictions, and we should have accepted somewhat more spread in order to not have people's lives be negatively impacted so much. And I think that what that misses is that this is a very weird case where basically if R is above 1, then pretty soon everyone has COVID. If R is below 0, pretty soon nobody has COVID. There kind of isn't really a middle ground. And what you want to do, well, you have two options. One is you could say, we're going to accept R is above 1. We're going to accept everyone basically is going to get exposed to COVID before the vaccines arrive. Probably 1 to 2% of the population will die. It could be like a bit more, a bit less, depending on how quickly you allow it to spread and how overwhelmed the hospital system is. But you could accept that on one side. Or what we have to do is we have to keep R just below 1, or like 0.9 to have a little bit of a buffer. And we're going to try to do that in the way that's least costly, that imposes the fewest costs possible. And there's really only these two strategies that you can adopt. And I worry that people are like imagining that there's some middle ground that we could have struck that would have been a lot nicer than and in fact the choice was just actually quite a brutal one.
Yeah, the middle ground solutions were actually kind of the worst, right? Which is where kind of the multi-party democracies kind of wound up with a lot of the time. In poker you call it like a raise or fold strategy, where often in the game theory equilibrium in poker, you either want to raise or fold and not call. So yeah, either you want to do like Sweden and be like, yeah, we're never going to get R below 1, so let's do more things outdoors and protect old people. But a lot of people are going to die,
Yeah.
Or you do like New Zealand, like, yeah, well, fortunately, we're like an island country in the South Pacific, and there are no cases yet. Let's just shut down the border for 2 years. And like those extreme strategies are more effective than kind of the muddling through. I think.
Through. I guess, so you would say we suffered a ton of costs socially. People, their well-being was much reduced. And at the same time, like by the time the vaccines arrived, half of people had been exposed anyway. So we'd already borne like half the cost roughly. I mean, maybe not quite as much because we managed to, spread out the curve, but.
Yeah, look, I mean, the R equals 1 model becomes complicated when you have reinfection. You start to introduce more parameters when you have, some duration of immunity from disease, although clearly like severe outcomes are diminished upon, they're going to be like long COVID. People get mad at me. Clearly the overall disease burden from COVID goes down, and probably people are infected with COVID all the time and don't even realize it right now. And there's like a long history of it's thought that some flus actually were maybe COVID-like conditions that are now just in the background and aren't a particularly big deal. And the fact that discussion of like quote unquote herd immunity got so stigmatized was one of a lot of things that like disturbed me about discussion about the pandemic.
An interesting point you make in the book is that you think it would be selfish of rich people like you or me, or I guess just people living good lives in rich countries, to try to stop AI development for too long. Maybe smaller pauses or temporary delays that could be reasonable, but trying to prevent AI progress from happening for decades, you think would be selfish. Can you explain why?
Because look, I think you have countries now, like France, for example, or maybe the Nordic countries, where they have, especially the Nordics, like relatively high equality, and they kind of are maybe like taking an off ramp and are saying, let's kind of preserve our society as it is. We've achieved some high level of human well-being and flourishing and goodness, right? So like, look, if every country had the standard of living of Norway or something, right? Then maybe I'd say, okay, because at some point you do have to worry about sustainability, right? Maybe then we have to totally focus on how do we make human flourishing sustainable for the long run. Maybe that means finding ways to hedge our bets with having colonies in outer space. Maybe it means serious attempts to pursue nuclear disarmament, for example, to protect against some of the lower risk existential threats. Maybe now is time to have asteroid defense systems or things like that, but we're so far removed from that. And who are we to say now as wealthy Westerners, let's kind of close the gate right now, right? Because there are signs of secular stagnation, especially in the West, but by most measures, world GDP growth actually peaked in roughly the 1970s. The fertility crisis is something which kind of, is only beginning to be discussed. I guess I kind of framed it as a crisis, which it might not be, but like the decline in fertility, where we might never get to 10 billion people globally, and you might have a lot of asymmetries as far as an aging population, thanks to advances in medical science, and like not that many workers to support them. Like that can create all types of frictions in society. So look, there's a pretty strong base case that AI is a ordinarily very important technology. I'm not quite sure how to put it. We have in the book this thing called the technological Richter scale, which is like a magnitude 7 is something that happens once a decade, and an 8 is once per century, and a 9 is like once per millennium. I mean, it may be, and I think in some ways, like given what, I think, you had like Vitalik Buterin on the other day, and he's talked about there's probably like a little bit of a slowdown relative to expectations and how large language models are doing, but that might actually be pretty good, right? That we have time to, derive mundane utility from them. And I was in San Francisco the other week and took like a Waymo for the first time, and it's really cool. I think people maybe, people I think extrapolate from trends too much, and it was seen as, driverless cars are not doing that well. I mean, I would be shocked if they don't make a huge impact on society, right? It was enough of a proof of concept because you're driving in like real conditions on like a, rainy, I don't know if it's rainy, it was sunny actually, sunny afternoon in San Francisco. And like, it's very intuitively avoiding pedestrians who are jaywalking and has a very smooth acceleration and like, doing things that are quite smart. And I think obviously like quite a bit better than human drivers, apparently in their own testing, which you can discount, but like they're 5x or something safer. So yeah, I think it's too early to say that let's kind of lift the drawbridge up and like stop technological progress right when people in the West have had it really good.
I like this point because it kind of flips the script on something that I think many people would say, well, actually, people in Silicon Valley are pursuing AI because they stand to benefit a lot personally. And I think in actual fact, over time, the benefits from AI would end up disseminating to basically everyone. I mean, you could listen to the Carl Schurman interview if you're not convinced by that, but I think he explains why it'd be very surprising if they didn't. And like if things go well, at least, or reasonably well, then almost everyone will end up benefiting a lot. And basically, just the worse off you are now, the more you stand to gain. If your life is already very good, then there's only so much better it can be. But if you're really struggling in poverty, then you just have far more upside potential.
I think it's probably mostly true, although it can have like counterintuitive effects, right? Like, so in poker, because there are game theory solutions, they're called solvers, and they're also, but they're kind of slow. And now there are AI tools that you can layer on top of game theory solutions to provide like fast, approximate Nash equilibria, which creates problems such as cheating, for example, in online poker. But it's funny, like if everyone is playing like a pure Nash equilibrium strategy, but they still have to physically execute the strategy, then the edge become all from like physical reads, right? Like kind of coolness under pressure. I think it's maybe not like so intuitive what skills are prioritized by AI and which aren't necessarily.
Yeah.
But I also worry that we kind of wind up in mild dystopias, right? One I call hyper-commodified casino capitalism, where you basically extract all the consumer surplus for producers and big corporations, right? They own our data. They have very good algorithms that use fuzzy logic to learn how to, make us pay the exact amount we'll pay for a flight from New York to London and extract every dollar we're willing to pay. And they kind of nudge us in ways that are subtly or not so subtly coercive when we supposedly have choices and not when we don't, right? And that if you have high agency and have good intuition for like what the AIs are doing, you can benefit from that. But if you don't, then you get kind of suckered in. Like that seems like a dystopian worry that I think is not existential, but catastrophic. And also some people's doom can include situations where human beings basically give up agency, right? Where maybe it's the AIs plus a few CEOs that have like, 90% of the decision-making capacity in the world, and that maybe we get to play like, I don't know, cool video games and things and have some nominal agency, but that's greatly diminished. Like that worries me quite a bit too.
Yeah, people can read the book if they want to hear more about that. The thing that so you're flipping the script a little bit and saying that it would be selfish to slow down AI progress. I think the sense there's another sense in which though I think the rest of the world and people in poverty are kind of getting screwed that I don't hear people talk about very much, which is that, so let's say that the world, humanity as a whole, faces some trade-off between, like, what is its risk appetite? It's got the potential for massive gain, but I guess you think the risk of doom from AI is like 2 to 20%. It's like less than half, but still pretty material. So we've got this tricky trade-off to say, well, the reward is there, but like, how much risk of, how much are we willing to delay, perhaps, in order to drive that down from 20 to 15%? Who can influence this? U.S. voters, kind of. Maybe California voters a little bit.
Yeah.
I guess a handful of people in the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah.
Possibly like some voters in the UK could like influence it a little bit on the margin. But that's basically it. Everyone else in the world, if they don't like what OpenAI is doing, or they don't like U.S. voter policy choices on this risk reward trade-off, they're just shit out of luck. And if people in Nigeria have a different kind of taste for risk versus reward, there's just nothing that they can do basically at all.
Part of the argument too is based on the fact that, so it says, I think if you could press a button to permanently and irrevocably stop AI development, right? But you get another chance to press it in 10 years. Like that part is key. Like and it's easier to say this now when you've had more awareness of AI X risk, and B, arguably, I think many people would say like a slower period of development in large language models. I think that the fast takeoff scenarios are probably quite a bit less likely. I mean, you have to, add more and more compute, and now Sam Altman wants $7 trillion worth of semiconductor chips and whatever else. I think there are probably going to be some plateaus or limits based on, so you extract all human text on the internet. I think to get to near human capabilities versus getting to superhuman capabilities, I think that's not a a straightforward extrapolation. It's one that I think would take a lot longer potentially. But I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to like not weight my own intuition that much also.
Yeah. Do you ever thought on that kind of the democratic legitimacy issue? Should there be some global referendum on this in an ideal world?
One Emmett Shear idea that didn't make it into the book, but I think might be worth talking about here is deliberative democracy, which has been tried in different ways, right? Where I guess it was in Rome or Greece where like they would just like kind of randomly call people and, you're going to have to be the senator, right? You have to be a senator for a year. Or a jury system is very much like this. I recently had to beg out of jury duty in New York by saying, I'm an author. I'm going on a book tour. I can't. Yeah. But like something like that, because you worry in a world where it's kind of statistical sampling. In a poll, in a weird way, is kind of a version of this, right? You pick a random representative sample of people. Look, I think democracy is a more robust metric than people assume.
Yeah, explain that.
I think that there is a lot of value in consensus. I think there's kind of value in the wisdom of crowds. I think people kind of knowing areas of their life. I think voters actually have like fairly good BS detectors. Like I'm not, I would never vote for Donald Trump. I'll vote for Kamala Harris. And I voted, I guess, for Biden and Clinton before that. But you can understand how a certain type of voter is upset that elites have become like self-serving in different ways. And that they're not being utilitarian. Like I think probably, from a utilitarian calculus that like Kamala Harris is better for various reasons. Although you have to think about like what's their stances on like X risks and things like that, right? I haven't seen people make those attempts too often. But like people aren't voting based on calculating their utility. I mean, they kind of are, maybe for things that directly affect them, like taxes or particular benefit programs they might be. Or, women might vote on abortion, or gay people might vote on gay rights, or trans people on trans rights and things like that. But they're kind of voting on like, where am I in this equilibrium? Am I on team A or team B? And I think sometimes like progressives and liberals and Democrats kind of rely too much on a certain model of rationality where people are kind of expected value maximizers as opposed to being in a game theory equilibrium where it's like, are you on my side, right? Are you on my side defending my interests or not? It's like the Democratic Party, for example, has been saying, we are the normal party, and if you're weird, go be a Republican. Well, actually kind of like probably a majority of people are weird, with that heuristic. And so, why isn't Kamala going after like the weird crypto voters or RFK Jr. voters or things like that and people that might, so I don't know.
The game theory thing that I think people miss about democracy is the primary, people evaluate, is democracy achieving the optimal policy outcomes? And it's like, no, it's not. But the real virtue that it has is that it's reducing violence. And this isn't so evident to us anymore because, countries like the US and UK haven't had civil wars lately. But if you're having elections every 4 years and you lose, then you think, well, what I should do is go away and try to persuade people and win in 4 years' time. But if you don't get a chance to vote again, then you're going to take up arms potentially against the government if you're sufficiently dissatisfied.
And this is the Francis Fukuyama argument about like why he thinks liberal democracy and kind of, market-based capitalism ultimately prevails, because that people are intrinsically competitive and you need to have a certain amount of competition in the world. Like this is, by the way, my other suspicion of EA is that like I think it may be in the same way that Marxism does misstates and underestimates human nature, that people want to compete. They want to compete and they want to have teams, and like what's kind of the optimum level of like having healthy competition where you kind of like protect the downside of the losers to some extent. But like people don't want like a utopian paradise.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about election forecasting. So something that I haven't heard you talk about before, which some listeners might have heard of, some won't have, is this system called, this alternative election forecasting system called the 13 Keys to the White House. Perhaps it's a little bit sadistic to force you to explain what this is, but could you explain what the 13 Keys are?
So the 13 Keys are a system by Alan Lichtman, who is a professor of government. I don't know if he's a professor emeritus, retired now, at, I believe, American University in Washington, D.C., which I think are an example of kind of the replication crisis and kind of junk science. Or let me kind of, so, one problem you have in election forecasting that's unavoidable is that you have a small sample of elections, right? Since American elections began voting in the popular vote, in 1860, before that, you would have state legislatures appoint candidates. It's a sample size of a few dozen, which is not all that large. And for modern election forecasting, the first kind of scientific polling was done in roughly 1936 and was very bad, by the way, at first. One election every 4 years. So you have a sample size of, 22 or something like that. So when you have a small sample size and a lot of plausible outcomes, you have a potential problem that people in this world might know called overfitting, which is you don't have enough data to fit a multi-parameter model. And there are different ways around this. I mean, you can, I don't know, I don't want to know if we want to get to modeling technique per se. But the keys to the White House is a system that claims to perfectly predict every presidential election dating back to, the 19th century based on 13 variables. There are a couple of problems when you try to apply this forward-looking. One is that a lot of the variables are subjective. So, is there a significant foreign policy accomplishment by the president? Is the opponent charismatic? These are things that if you know the answer already, you can overfit and kind of p-hack your way to saying, okay, now we can predict every election perfectly when we already know the answer. It's not that hard to predict, quote unquote, correctly when the outcome's already known. So when the election's moving forward, then actually Alan Lichtman will issue his prediction, but it's not obvious. You have to wait for him to come on stage or come on YouTube now and say, here's what I predict here based on my judgment. So he's, it's a judgment call, a lot of these factors. Also, he's kind of lied in the past about whether he was trying to predict the Electoral College or the popular vote and shifted back and forth based on which was right and which was wrong. But he's a good marketer, taking the system that's just kind of punditry with some, minimal kind of qualitative edge or quantitative edge and try to make it seem like it's something more rigorous than it is.
So it's got 13 different factors in it.
Yeah.
I guess there's so many things that are crazy about this, and you don't even, I think, need to look at the empirics to tell that this is just junk science and totally mad. So he's got 13 factors that I guess he's squeezed out of. I mean, in the modern era, there's only a dozen, at most 2 dozen elections you can think about, because we're really going to be saying, oh, it's all the same now as it was in the 19th century. That seems nuts. So he's got 13 different factors. Almost all of these come on a continuum. A candidate can be more or less charismatic, right? It's not just 1 or 0. But he squeezes it into the candidate is charismatic or the candidate is not, or the economy is good, the economy is bad. So he's throwing out almost all this information. He's got so many factors, despite the fact that he's got almost no data to tell which one of these goes in. He hasn't changed it, I think, since 1980 or something when they came up with it.
Yeah, and he says, for example, that Donald Trump is not charismatic. By the way, he's a liberal Democrat, and I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but he literally hosted a reality TV show. He was a game show host. I think there's a certain type of charisma that comes through with that. And that's the one thing he probably does have is that he's, charismatic, maybe not in a way that a Democrat might like, but he's a funny guy. He's an entertainer, literally. So I don't know how you wouldn't give him that key, for example. And look, it's not bad. Sometimes you have a situation where you have a small sample size. It's not a terrible idea to say, let's just take a whole bunch of different frameworks and kind of average them out. That's not actually such a bad idea. Here are all the reasonable approaches we might take and make kind of a mental average of the different models that you might take. But you want heuristics that you build in ahead of time that you don't then have to apply subjectivity to. Even for forecasters, I think an election can be an emotional affair, or you can have a personal preference for the outcome, or you can get invested in your forecast where you probably stand to gain more future opportunities if your forecast is perceived as being right. So you want to set up rules in advance that you're not allowed to change later, more or less, unless something's literally broken. If you're building the silver bullets in election model is several thousand lines of computer code. If we caught some actual bug, then a minus sign instead of a plus sign, then we'd have to own up to that and change it potentially. But I think it kind of defeats the purpose of rigorous forecasting. By the way, that model was already wrong this year because it said that Joe Biden would defeat Donald Trump, and Joe Biden was losing so badly they had to quit the race. So you have a survivorship bias problem too in evaluating this forecast.
Yeah. So I think a statistician can just glance at this model and say that it can't be right. We must be able to do better than this. But it's incredibly popular. Every 4 years, it gets a whole lot of attention. I think it used to get more attention back in the 90s. I guess people worry that academia lacks credibility now, but I think we forget just how bad people were at assessing evidence back in the 80s and 90s and early areas.
Look, in some ways, it kind of fits a stereotype of what an expert is supposed to provide you with, right? Where it's like saying, okay, well, here's the hidden. I mean, if you go and look at like best-selling nonfiction books, every subtitle is like the hidden factor behind X or like the secret factor behind X, right? It's like it's a very well marketed system where it's like, I, the expert, am going to reveal these secret keys and you put them together and you unlock the White House, basically. Whereas for the silver bulletin model, it's like, just a fancy average of polls, basically. And like, actually, it's a very hard problem statistically because of the way polls are correlated. And there's lots of things you have to figure out. But just the polls, basically. And we're never going to be certain. We're just going to be probabilistic. It's like actually kind of harder to sell to the mainstream, I think.
Yeah. Are there any other really popular kind of fake quantity things in the media that get covered a lot that are similarly dubious to the 13 keys?
I mean, there must be, right? I mean, I don't know. There's like the Groundhog Day if the groundhog sees its shadow and things like that, and kind of quasi. But like, I think election forecasting is kind of unique in just the tempo of it. You have it like every 4 years. I mean, so there's some stuff. If you're watching like a football match, either American or European football, right? Then you'll see keys to the match and things like that, right? And it's often like really obvious things like the team that scores more points will win. The team that gains more yards will win probably. So there's some of that kind of, you're saying obvious things and making them seem profound. I think that's probably something of universal. But elections are this really weird zone where they happen once every 4 years, once every 2 years counting midterm elections, which is enough to have some regularity, but never to quite have like certainty.
On that topic, I recently saw a paper that was titled Assessing the Reliability of Probabilistic U.S. Presidential Election Forecasts May Take Decades. I think you might have seen this one recently.
I tweeted about it.
So I asked Claude to give a brief summary of the paper, and some of the points that it put out were presidential elections are rare events. They occur only every 4 years. This provides very few data points to assess forecasting methods. And the authors demonstrate through simulations that it would take 24 election cycles or 96 years to show with 95% confidence that a forecaster with 75% accuracy outperformed random guessing. And that comparing the performance of competing forecasters with similar accuracy levels could take thousands of years. What do you make of that?
So I challenge these guys to a bet. If they think that it's no better than random, then I'm happy. I mean, right now our model, as we're recording this in early September, full disclosure, is close to 50-50. So if they think that's no better than a coin flip, then I'm happy to make a substantial bet with these academics. Because like, look, am I allowed to swear on this show, or is it like not a swear? It's like, okay, you have an event once every 4 years. To get a statistically significant sample will take a long time. Yeah, no shit, okay? You don't have to like waste a slot in an academic journal with this incredibly banal and obvious observation. But I'd say a couple of things. One is that when you actually have a sample size, which is not just the presidential elections, but presidential primaries and midterm elections, in midterm elections, there are roughly 500 different races for Congress every year. Of course, they're correlated, which makes this kind of quite complicated structurally, but there's a little bit more robustness in the data than they might say. But also they're kind of caught in this, I kind of consider it the like replication crisis paradigm of like, you hit some magic number when it's 95% and then it's true instead of false. And that's just not, I mean, I'm a Bayesian, right? I mean, I don't think that way. If you have, one of the authors of the paper was saying, well, based on one election, you can't tell whether, so in 2016, models had Trump with anywhere from a 29% chance, that was a then FiveThirtyEight model, to a less than 1% chance, 0.1%, let's call it. And they said, well, you can't really tell anything from one election, which model is right or which model isn't. And like, actually, it's not true. If you like apply
the prediction is so
Bayes'
extreme
theorem and you have a 0.1% chance happening, a model that's never actually been published before, and it's wrong, the odds are overwhelming that that model is inferior based on that sample size of 1 to the 29% chance model. So to me, it kind of indicates a certain type of rigid academic thinking, which is not fast enough to deal with the modern world. In the modern world, by the time you kind of prove something to an academic standard, then the market's priced it in. The advantage that you might milk from that has already been realized. It's interesting to see effective altruism, which comes out of academia, but understands that like you're having debates that occur quickly in the public sphere on, the EA forums, for example, and they're big believers in being in the media. And that part I like, that like the velocity of academia is not really fit for today's world.
Yeah. So I think presumably the authors of this paper wouldn't really want to say that your model is not better, is no better than a coin flip. But I guess what they're saying is, imagine that there were two models that were similarly good, like your model and one that was a bit different, that gave a bit more weight to the fundamentals versus polling or something like that, and say it gave Trump a 27% chance when you gave it a 29% chance. It's actually like quite difficult to distinguish which of these is better empirically, and so you might have to turn to theory, and then that's not really going to be decisive. Well, what do you make of that sort of idea?
I get a little perturbed because like we are the only, so the legacy of FiveThirtyEight, now Silver Bulletin models, this is one of a pretty rare case of having forecast in the public domain where there is a complete track record of every forecast we've made, both in politics and sports since 2008. And they're very well calibrated, right? Our 20% chances happen 20% of the time. You get a much larger sample size through sports than through elections. But yeah, I mean, it's like this abstract of like basically no other model in this space has a track record over more than one election. And we also are having presidential primaries and things like that. So there's quite a long track record now. And yeah, I would think academics who are interested in public discourse would be more appreciative of it's much harder to make actual forecasts where you put yourself out there and under conditions of uncertainty and publish them so they can be vetted and observed than to backtest a model.
Yeah.
So I think there is, I think there's probably some degree of jealousy where, there is, right?
Yeah.
That you take these ideas and you popularize them and there's a pretty big audience for them.
Yeah.
But also I'm taking every time I make a forecast. We've had 70-30 calls where we're perceived as being wrong and you're taking reputational risk. And so I don't know.
Yeah. I guess the real reason that I care about your forecasts and think that they're credible is I guess less the track record and more that I've looked at how I understand how it operates internally, and I think, yes, that is the process that's actually generating the outcome. This is where the randomness is coming in. But this paper made me realize I didn't understand it perhaps quite as well as I thought I did. So given that you only have, a dozen, 2 dozen data points in the modern era that you can think about, how exactly do you figure out how to weight, say, the fundamentals versus the polling and how to change that over time? It seems like you might not really have enough data to specify that very closely.
So this is where it's both an art and a science for sure. And there are things like I probably err on the side of weighting the fundamentals, meaning things like the economy or incumbency less, because there's more researcher degree of freedom in that there are a lot of ways to specify, there are dozens of economic variables that are published, or actually more than dozens. There are thousands of variables that are published by the Federal Reserve or other organizations and updated quarterly or more often, right? And so part of it is having experience of model building where you don't want to fit every parameter to the back-tested data, right? You want to say, okay, let me come up with a good index of the economy. How would, for example, someone trying to determine if the economy is in recession is kind of the idea, create an index of the economy which is not binary between 1, 0, but fluid. And then having picked that definition of the economy, combine that with the polls and see how well that it does. And then when you're doing that, understanding that there probably still is kind of a little bit more overfitting in one part of the model than the other. And so it's look, you have a lot of decision points. If you're designing a complex model like this, it's, again, several thousand lines of code. You might have like 40 or 50 or something like legitimate points of decision to make. I think it's worthwhile to kind of keep mental notes on maybe kind of in which direction those different decisions might err, right? If you make a decision that, hey, this is a slightly cleaner way to do it, but might be a little bit overconfident or might lend itself toward overconfidence, and maybe the next decision that you make, you would say, okay, this is going to be a more cautious assumption. But it's tough. I think anyone who says that like, oh, you just kind of feed data into a computer. Maybe with AI, right, it becomes more where you lose the legibility. But I'm still working in the space where, like, if you read Silver Bulletin, there'll be these like 2,000 word-long posts that kind of explain, here is what the model is doing. Here is why when I designed the model, I designed it this way. Here is why that assumption may or may not be right now. And you can look at the raw data before we get to a certain stage of the model and make a different assumption. But like that's a thought process that like you actually have in the real world, right? If I've done consulting from time to time for financial terms, right? And they're like, well, we want kind of both your model and we also want your experience and kind of your brain, so to speak, right? And a model is a tool or a device. It's important not to use the model as necessarily being oracular. It's a disciplining mechanism to force you to think through questions more rigorously. Now, when you get into truly data-rich environments, like some sports applications, then you can kind of say, okay, we have thousands and thousands of games to test this on. We can just kind of like, we worry a little bit about overfitting the model, but for the most part, you can be more strictly empirical. You can't do that in these kind of small n problems, which are, again, like kind of more like the problems that you might face in EA or rationalism, right? Where it's about like, how do you make a good estimate? Sometimes parts of it you can model very rigorously, and sometimes parts of it that you can't. You hope that the parts that are more rigorous are kind of higher leverage. One thing that's very important to do is robustness check, right? If there are two reasonable ways to specify a parameter or a function in the model, and they give radically different answers, then almost for sure you have to find some way to take an average of those two, right? If there are two different ways and they give you the same answer, then you can simplify it by just saying, I'm just going to use one of these because we don't need the extra degree of freedom or whatever. So, understanding that when you kind of like kick a tire on a model and how robust is it to changes in assumptions, like that's the skill, that's kind of the experience and art, I guess, of model building.
Yeah. On this question of how low data environment that this actually is, I guess the paper makes the point that you might think, oh well, you're forecasting 50 different states, so in fact you have 50 different data points, but actually you don't, because these things are super correlated. If you get half of them, probably you'll get the other half as well, and likewise, if you get the first half wrong, the other one is probably going to have errors as well. But it seems like quite an American-focused paper, because couldn't you say, I'm going to think about this modeling operation or this forecaster, and they're going to forecast elections both in the US and all around the world using similar mentality, using similar methods. And then you could suddenly have a massively larger data set on how good that modeler is at thinking about elections in general. And you might have some external validity questions, maybe the accuracy for just one class of elections might be a bit different, but I still think you could expand the N enormously. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, if you looked at like all European parliamentary elections, for example, you have to be careful. In India, for example, the polling is incredibly inaccurate. It's off by an average of about like 11 points, whereas in the US and Europe, it's about like 3 points on average. The reason why is partly that there are so many different like ethnic groups and racial groups, but also like it's a country where there is not a culture, and I'm stereotyping, I apologize, but I have spoken to local experts on this and done some work myself, where it's not a culture where you're necessarily terribly forthcoming with strangers, right? That if someone asks you for your political views, maybe you're not going to communicate that in a way that reveals your true preferences. Whereas in the Anglo cultures, especially the US, we tend to be more forthright about that stuff.
On this question of people treating forecasts in an oracular way, there's been a real flourishing of prediction markets. I guess there's Manifold, Polymarket, which you do some consulting for, Metaculus. Do you think that, I guess I spent years trying to get people to pay more attention to these things. Yeah. Do you think now possibly they're a bit overrated? Especially the small markets rather than, big presidential elections, niche things like, is Elon going to drop his lawsuit against someone or other?
I mean, there can be times when, and this is true, by the way, of other types of markets. It can be true of sports betting markets, for example. There can be times when people ascribe too much wisdom to the markets and it becomes kind of circular logic, right? So, during the Democratic National Convention, there was a rumor circulated there's going to be a surprise guest appearance. And of course, Polymarket, I think maybe Manifold too, had betting markets on who the surprise guest would be. Would it be Taylor Swift or like some Republican like George Bush endorsing Kamala Harris? However, the market decided that it was going to be Beyonce. And these rumors began to swirl and circulate. And so, people would tweet like, oh, it's now 80% for Beyonce. And then got all the way up to 96% or 97%. And then like her representatives had to send something to TMZ saying, no, she's not even in the same city right now as convention's being held, so this is not going to happen. So that might have been a case of kind of like circular logic, where everyone thinks everyone else knows something. You have this kind of like false like focal point. For the most part, though, look, for political betting markets, you finally have like a lot more liquidity. They're very different. Like, to me, the leading two are Polymarket and Manifold, or Manifest. Excuse me, Manifest is a conference that Manifold markets held. Manifold is play money, but has an incredibly dedicated community that cares a lot about reputational stakes and skin in the game. And like Polymarket has like real liquidity and is well structured. Some of the ones in the past would make it such that you had asymmetric problems with kind of, betting on 2% outcomes and things like that. These markets are now pretty well structured and have enough volume and liquidity to, I think, be quite a bit better. And I know that like, as everything becomes kind of eaten by politics, then, financial firms, investment banks, and hedge funds want to consider political risk, right? If you're trying to forecast interest rates in the long term, whether Trump or Harris will be president is quite relevant to that, or U.S.-China foreign policy and the long-term value of NVIDIA or things like that. So you have a market need to forecast political risk, and now you have some tools to help with that.
So one of my colleagues who's been a fan of prediction markets over the years, but is now a little bit worried that they're overrated. He wrote this into me saying, it's useful to make models about complex questions, but when they spit out a number, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've learned that much. And prediction markets can launder a little more than guesses into numbers that have much more respectability than a few people's opinions. But sometimes they're not actually that much more than that. Also, the Breyer scores of even super forecasters aren't that great. So forecasting is really more like poker than chess. The experts can have an edge, but often go on very long losing streaks to even amateurs. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that for sure, right? In markets in general, including gambling, you can have small edges that persist for a long time if you're very good, or large edges that persist for a short time if you're very good. But you never have like a long edge that persists for a long time. There's like too much efficiency in the market. You can also have like recursiveness. So some people say, why don't you use prediction markets as an input in the Silver Bulletin model? Well, Silver Bulletin model moves prediction markets sometimes. So you have a certain amount of recursiveness. It can be easy to say, oh, look, all these independent indicators suggest the race is going to go this way, when in fact there's non-independence, when in fact, the reason why experts think it's going to be Harris or whatever is because prediction markets say that, and the reason prediction markets say that's because the experts say it, right? And if you then have polling models that are non-independent from that, then you wind up in a place where you can become overconfident and have these big asymmetric tail risks.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's a case where possibly the forecast would be more accurate if you added in other indicators like experts or prediction markets, but it would be less useful in a way because it's like just merging in your thing with other stuff in a somewhat unclear way. Yeah,
this is another thing that you learn by like building a lot of actual models is like the amount of, the trader term is like alpha, the amount of like value you provide, that might not be quite right, but like, an indicator that's like highly correlated with other indicators, so for example, let's say if you kind of like had the polling average, plus 0.1% for the Democrat will be almost as accurate as a polling average, but it provides no additional value because it's just a linear function of the polling average, right? Whereas something like the number of yard signs in a political campaign in Manassas, Virginia or something is totally uncorrelated with the polling and may have maybe a very poor predictor on its own, but might provide, an extra, 0.01% of R squared or something.
So in my world, people who have qualified for the kind of super forecaster qualification tend to be treated a little bit as oracles, or their opinions are given a lot of extra weight. There was this forecasting tournament, which we've actually had an interview come out about. I think about forecasting persuasion tournament. Ezra Kaga ran it, which you talk about in the book. And in that experiment, they found that people, super forecasters who didn't know that about AI in particular, thought there was a 0.2% chance of AI causing doom, like in broad strokes, a 0.2% chance. Whereas experts in AI who weren't super forecasters thought that there was more like a 2% chance of AI causing extinction by some end date, I can't remember. And somewhat to my surprise, you said that you would probably go with the AI experts over the super forecasters in that case. Why is that?
I do think the AI experts have enough grounding in kind of like the rationalist community, and being aware of these kind of cognitive biases that forecasters have, that I think they're actually incorporating those heuristics into their models for the most part. I'm giving them credit for being kind of super nerdy, probably in many cases high IQ nerds who like are already accounting for that, but then add domain knowledge to that. I mean, usually the issue is that if you have the inside view, you have more information, but your heuristics may be worse for varying reasons, ranging from that you've never really kind of studied the kind of META meta stuff about forecasting to the fact that like, you're a little bit close to the data. You may have perverse incentives to some degree.
Well, you might have been selected, right? Maybe you went into you're an AI expert because you had this
obviously
view.
every hammer looks like a nail problem. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Oh, yeah. No, every nail looks. No.
When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Exactly,
is the correct metaphor, I guess. I think there's something to be said that if you kind of like survey only people who are in AI risk, but I think like the Katja Gray survey also surveys engineers for the AI labs and not just like people who are in AI safety per se. And they also are fairly
they say more than 2% chance, I think.
Yeah. I mean, some of them, the media can get up to like 5% or 10%. So yeah, look, I'm giving credit to kind of the broader EA rationalist community for having better meta heuristics than your typical pundits, I suppose.
Something you say in the book that surprised me is that venture capitalists talk a big game about taking risks and revolutionizing the world and changing everything and being willing to upend it all. But you actually think they don't take that much risk. Why is that?
It turns out that if you get so, are you a basketball fan or a sports fan?
Soccer sometimes, yeah.
In American sports, we have the draft, which is a mechanism for giving the worst team more competitive equality over the long run. If you're the worst team, you get the first pick. You therefore get the next good player. For the top Silicon Valley firms, it's almost the reverse of this, right? Where if you're Andreessen Horowitz or Founders Fund or Sequoia, and you're very successful, then you get the first draft pick. The next founder that comes over from, Ireland or Sri Lanka or, it's from across the country or whatever else will want to then work with this firm that has bigger network effects. And so I think the top firms are kind of, Mark Andreessen even told me this, that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, their success, right? Where they have access to the top founder talent all over the world, that the expected value of any given bet is quite high. And yes, there's high variance, but he actually gave me some data. And if you do the math, like almost every fund they make is going to make some money. The risk of ruin is actually very, very, very low.
Because they're diversified across hundreds of different...
Diversified, you have a fund that has 20 companies a year. And by the way, it's not true that like it's totally hit or miss. There are plenty of like 1Xs and 2Xs, or even getting half your money back. Like that helps actually quite a bit over the long run. So it's a very, very robust business where like, where they're kind of guaranteed to make like a really nice profit every year. Now, look, I think a lot of them are like, risk-taking personality types, but they kind of have a business that's like too good to fail almost. Whereas founders, like a founder may be making a bet that is plus EV in principle, right? If you have like, but the founder's life may not be that great much or most of the time. To commit to an idea that has like a 10-year time horizon that results in complete failure some percentage of the time, results in a moderate exit after a lot of sweat equity some larger percent of the time, and has a 1 in 1,000 chance if you're now the next Mark Zuckerberg, or 1 in 10,000, like that's, less obviously a good deal depending on the degree of risk aversion you have. And you have to have like some risk-takingness or kind of risk ignorance, I call it, in order to found a company in an area that has not achieved market success so far and has this very long time horizon.
Yeah. So reading this, it made me wonder, are founders getting screwed by VCs? Why is it that they're in this relationship where the VCs are taking very little risk? They also get, but they get a kind of high, nearly guaranteed return. The founders are taking enormous personal risk. They also, some of the time, do really well, but lots of the time they don't do that well at all. They bear much more risk than the VCs do. Why didn't the VCs kind of give them more of a stable salary, like give them more, $200,000 every year so that they're more insured against the risk that their business goes badly, given that they can easily afford it?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, maybe there are opportunities for like different VC business models. Maybe whichever kind of VC has a big falling out with one of the big VC firms should try an alternative model where it's a little bit more founder friendly, potentially, or you get kind of more equity early on. I mean, I think they sometimes want founders who are quote unquote more hungry and sleeping in the group house and things like that. But yeah, I wonder, and I think frankly, again, I'm not super PC, but I think they have to be missing talent from founders who are women or founders who are not white or Asian men, basically. I mean, that has to be true.
Something you explain in the book is that, VCs, they talk about being very contrarian, being different than other people, but you actually think that they are super herdy, that they tend to be very conformist within VC. Why is it that that is the better strategy rather than kind of doing the thing that's different than what everything else is funding, so you can get new, different opportunities?
So for one thing, I don't think that this market is necessarily hyper efficient. It's such a good ROI if you're a top decile firm that I don't think they're optimizing every angle necessarily, right? I think they're getting kind of the big heuristics right, which is have a long time horizon and bet on companies with big upside. If you make enough of those bets, it's a very high expected value on average, and get a lot of things at the margin quite wrong. There are other things too, so it's very hard. You can't really short an early stage company, and so therefore it's a culture where there's not a lot of negging, and they all invest and reinvest at different stages of one another's companies, so they have a lot of kind of correlated interest. I think it's one reason why they're so bothered by criticism as compared to the hedge fund guys. The hedge fund guys are always looking for where is conventional wisdom wrong. They're critical, used to being criticized, whereas Silicon Valley is a no negging culture as much. It's also just kind of a small number of people, right? The number of VCs that really are movers and shakers is, a couple of dozen at most probably, whereas the number of movers and shakers in kind of Wall Street, the hedge fund / venture, or not venture capital, the Wall Street, the New York hedge fund, investment bank, private equity world is hundreds or thousands probably, right? So the scale is really small and maintaining group relations. I mean, in some ways what they're trying to do is predict the behavior of their friends, right? They are the influencers almost who are going to the hot new club, and they want to ensure their friend will have a good time at the hot new club. If it feels played out, they'll lose. If they're too early on the trend, they'll lose. So it's more of a social activity than people I think assume, and it's a small, tight-knit group of people.
Final question. So with the venture capitalist world, I think you say the reason that they have to herd so much is that they don't want to be 100% of the funding for any company as it scales up. So it's a big problem for them. That imagine that they make a great investment in a company that has a lot of potential, but it's weird in some way. I guess you talk about a black woman founder, I might be an example of this, where someone thinks this business has great potential. However, they think that other VCs won't be interested in funding it because of their prejudices, say. And so they don't want to get in because this company won't be able to raise enough funding from enough different groups to go through its Series B, Series C, and so on. Should VCs they could solve this problem individually if they were willing to take more risk, if they were willing to say, I'm willing to be 100%, I'm willing to back this person 100%, and even if other VCs don't like it, I'm going to take them all the way, just with my money. And even though that exposes me to less diversification, I'm willing to do it. Should they do it?
I agree. I mean, they have plenty of money, right? Maybe they should be more of that, right? Maybe it's kind of mission-driven VCs. I mean, you have some VCs who are more mission-driven for, companies I think will be good for the environment, for example, or good for kind of global welfare and poverty reduction. So yeah, I think there's room for more diversification within the VC model. Because, look, anytime, again, the whole history of gambling or investing, to have edges that are very large, that persist for a very long time, that's very rare, right? So maybe in 20 years, someone will write the next book about how actually 2024 was the time of peak VC before people realize that this is too good to be true, and maybe between other private options and maybe governments and founders taking more revenge, or not revenge, but saying actually I have more leverage as a founder than you might assume, and maybe chipping away at this extremely high and impressive but extremely high excess returns.
My guest today has been Nate Silver, and the book is On the Edge: The Art of Risking Everything. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Nate.
Of course. Thank you so much.
If you liked that episode, some others you might like as well include episode 163, Toby Ord on the perils of maximizing the good that you do. Episode 200, Ezra Kaga on what super forecasters and experts think about existential risks. And episode 176, Nathan Lebenz on the final push for AGI, Understanding OpenAI's leadership drama and red teaming frontier models. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris, video editing by Simon Monsua, audio engineering by Ben Fordell and Marla Maguire and Dominic Armstrong. Full transcripts and extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together, as always, by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.